Hey everyone, this is James from TDB bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I'm going to be talking about looking at websites and shopping for Puer tea and some of the red flags and yellow flags that you'll run into there. And I did some poking around on the internet, as one does, before hitting record on this episode. And to be honest, I think the Puer world has improved quite a bit. Either that, or I just don't know where to look for the worst offenders of these types of things. So yeah, I think the Puer world is a little unique in this regard. Not that there aren't bullshit oolongs or black teas or anything like that, but it does, because of the nature of what gets marketed in Puer in terms of regions and tree ages and things that are basically very easy to lie about and misinformation to be passed down. Like, it's not even necessarily the vendor that's lying about it. They could have been lied to before then. In fact, there have been many such cases. So it's hard to know where exactly the information does go wrong, but it's a place where it's very easy to be taken advantage of and lied to some extent. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is Puer that is too cheap. Now, this one's hard because Puer can get pretty inexpensive. When it comes to something like those Shaguan tools that used to sit behind me, those teas are really inexpensive, especially if you could get it from a part of the Chinese market that's pretty close to the source. So if you were to buy like a Jiaji tool from last year, you wouldn't expect that tea to cost more than a few dollars for 100 grams. And so knowing why it's too cheap, or which sorts of teas it would be too cheap for, is kind of the trick there. And I think especially when it comes to very, very sought after areas, this is also where you're most commonly going to see the offenders here. So if you see like any tea that's being marketed as like a really hyped area, so Laobanjiang, Shigui, Bingdao, those sorts of things, and the tea is just too cheap. What is too cheap? That's another trick. It's hard to know. But if you see, it's not uncommon to see like a Laobanjiang being sold for, 20 cents a gram or something. So yeah, you can call BS on that. And unfortunately, to know that, you do need to know a little bit more about kind of the areas and things like that. So as a rule, it's generally, you want to take those kind of big areas and the really hyped ones all with a grain of salt, especially if you don't really know what you're looking for and if you're not totally sure whether to trust a vendor or not. In fact, I would say in Puer, your default should be to approach every vendor with a bit of caution and to, don't trust everyone 100%, because there is a lot of misinformation out there, whether it's being passed down by the vendor themselves or the person that gave them information. Another thing that you'll run into too, and this one applies to more aged tea, is exact years. Absolutely possible to know where stuff is like 2015, 2018. For the last couple decades, that's totally true. But when it comes to tea from like the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, tea was not quite so precious at that time. And as a result, we don't have exact dates for a lot of different teas. So if some vendors like, oh yeah, this tea is from 1979, this Puer tea, I would tend to treat that as a pretty big red flag unless I really, really trusted them and trusted that they knew exactly what they were doing. And I'll be honest, that's not many people when it comes to saying like the exact age, 1979, 1986. Interestingly enough, this comes up the most often when I see people looking for tea from their birth year. For me, at least, that's 1986. If someone was marketing me a Puer from 1986, my default would definitely be not to trust it, just because like to have an exact date for a production from 1986, it's quite difficult. It's not impossible, again, and if you are someone that likes to be 100% on stuff, Puer maybe not the realm for you, because it is certainly possible that a tea could be from 1986, but it's very, very hard to know. So you want to, I would treat that as a bit of a red flag too. Perhaps, and this one kind of falls into this nebulous ground of just overselling too. Anyone that's really overselling the master, overselling the story, overselling the poetry of them, that to me is also a bit of a yellow red flag. To me, at least, I want my Puer descriptions to be simple, very basic information. Is it a blend? Is it tippy? Where is the basic raw material from? For me, at least, and this kind of brings us into the next one, which is not really a red flag so much as like another thing to watch out for when you're reading Puer descriptions, is the areas. Areas can be quite helpful. And for me, at least, I find areas to be the most helpful when it's kind of a broad area. So something like Monghai County or Bulong Mountain. These are big places. When it comes to kind of the individual villages and things like that, I think that's where you start to treat it a little bit more like a yellow flag and treat it with a grain of salt. It's not to say that that's necessarily misinformation. In fact, in many cases, it very well could be correct if it's a trusted vendor. But if you don't know it's a trusted vendor, and by default, probably most vendors should not be trusted, then you should, take that into account, certainly. Closer to a red flag is when you get super, super old trees. And again, this lie can be sort of relative. Again, this is one where if you get exact years on the trees, then you can sort of roll your eyes. It's like, oh, these trees are 187 years old. It's like, sure. I'm sure they were exactly dated 187 years ago from 1836 or whatever. But generally speaking, if something is like 1,000 years old or in the multiple hundreds, you should treat that pretty cautiously and approach with caution versus if something is like 40 or 50 years old or less. So this is one of those things that is a little bit relative to the scale. There was a time where I think for tea and Misty Peaks were marketing teas as like being from thousands-year-old trees. And, those teas would fall under both that kind of BS marketing of being super old trees, but also being way too cheap for what they're selling for. If those teas were confirmed as being from trees of that age, they would be selling for much more. And of course, people are going to come up with the stories like, oh, they weren't confirmed, or the farmer is cutting us a special deal, yada, yada, yada. But in general, that's again, overselling the story. So this sort of Venn diagram of red flags and yellow flags overlapping can really converge into this place where you can see a vendor kind of twisting their words and stuff into this very elaborate story to why they can sell this 1,000-year-old tree from Lao Banjong for 25 cents a gram. And it's just absurd. Is it possible? I suppose in a world it is, but it is extremely unlikely. And so, and when you're buying tea, you're not dealing in certainty. You're dealing partly in just probability and likelihood. You want to kind of lean towards good bets versus bad bets. And in my opinion, a lot of these things will if you pay attention to these flags, you're going to do a much better job at avoiding those really bad bets and lean more into the better ones. I would say in general, vendors that are pretty good, most of the vendors we feature here on TDB are pretty good about their descriptions, certainly these days. So Teas We Like, Yunnan Sourcing, White Tea. White tea is an interesting one because people get pissed off, really pissed off. In fact, I'm always surprised at how annoyed they are because they refuse to give info. For me personally, I do wish that they would give a little more info some of the time, but not all of the time. In fact, I find their whole endeavor about not mentioning regions to be quite admirable. But I think it would be helpful for me to know, oh, this is a Monghai County blend. This one has an Evu flavor. And I do know they do sometimes mention that, but for me at least, I like to have kind of like those broad characteristics. And Yunnan Sourcing, I think, is just very simple to the point. Same thing with Teas We Like. Like to know kind of the range of leaves. Is it a tippy blend? Are there multiple villages blended in, or is this kind of more of a single village thing? And just to know basic stuff about the flavor. For me, at least, those are kind of the ideal descriptions for the tea. Other than that, I just need to know kind of the basics of the size of the cake, what it sells for, and then you just you sample it, and that is the ultimate way you can compare it. But definitely don't be oversold on the story or anything like that. So I think that just about wraps up this episode. So let me know if there are other things that I'm missing. You can pay attention to these things, and I would definitely recommend it for beginners to kind of treat all of those things very cautiously. You should not, by default, assume that vendors are saying something that you can take as 100% truth. Hope that this is helpful. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers.